I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
The snow, a fresh, inconsiderate blanket, had done its best to muffle the usual cacophony of West 35th Street. But even a foot of winter white couldn't entirely silence the distant anemic cheer of approaching New Year's Eve. I preferred the sound of my own typewriter clacking out the mundane details of Wolfe's current accounting ledger to the drunken promises of Auld Lang Syne. My boss, currently ensconced in the orchid rooms, was undoubtedly of the same mind. My concentration, a fragile thing at the best of times, splintered when the doorbell chimed. Not the usual robust summons, but a timid, almost apologetic tinkle, as if the person on the other side were already regretting their presumption. I glanced at the clock, 4:30, too early for dinner, too late for a truly urgent summons, and far too soon for the evening's festivities to have devolved into actual desperation. I straightened my tie, a purely reflexive action, as I knew full well the visitor wasn't there for my sartorial approval, and made my way to the front door. Through the peephole, a woman's face, pale and framed by a fur collar, hovered uncertainly. Her eyes, large and a little fearful, darted around as if she expected a mugger to leap from the snowdrift by the stoop. I opened the door, letting in a gust of frigid air and the faint scent of expensive perfume. "Good afternoon," I offered, trying to sound as unwelcoming as possible without actually being rude. "It's an art form, really, when you work for Nero Wolfe. Mr. Goodwin." Her voice was soft, with a tremor that suggested eite. A genuine distress or a very good acting coach, the one and only. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I need to see Mr. Wolfe." I assessed her quickly. Mid-30s, impeccably dressed, though her cashmere coat was dusted with melting snowflakes, and her perfectly coiffed blonde hair had a few errant strands. Her handbag, clutched tight, looked like it cost more than my monthly salary. No obvious sigh, sheerness of a struggle, no tears, just that undercurrent of anxiety. "Mr. Wolfe is engaged," I informed her, already formulating the usual excuses, incommunicado, meditating, wrestling with the meaning of existence, etc. Her gaze, however, was already past me, sweeping through the hall towards the vague promise of the office. "It's about the poinsettia diamond, and Julian, the poinsettia diamond, Tea got my attention. It had been splashed across the society pages for weeks, a famous flawless crimson gem, recently acquired by the notorious financier Julian Thorne, only to vanish from his locked vault 2 nights ago. The police were baffled, the insurance company was in a lather, and Thorne himself had issued a rather dramatic, public plea for its return. I hesitated. Wolfe usually cultivated a profound disinterest in anything that didn't directly threaten his comfort or financial stability. But the poinsettia, that was a bold theft, a challenge to the very concept of secure possession. And Thorne, for all his flash, was known to be a man who valued precision. "Come in, Miss Vance," I said, stepping aside. "You can wait in the office. I'll see if Mr. Wolfe is available to be disturbed." She entered, leaving a tiny puddle of melted snow on the Persian rug, an act that would normally earn a glare from Wolfe if he were present. I led her to a client's chair, the one designed for maximum discomfort to discourage dawdling, and watched her settle with a sigh that spoke volumes of accumulated strain. "Don't touch anything," I advised, purely out of habit, "and try not to breathe too loudly. Mr. Wolfe finds it distracting." I didn't wait for a reply, instead heading for the kitchen. Fritz, bless his culinary soul, was probably prepping something exquisite for dinner. He could gauge Wolfe's mood better than anyone, usually through the thickness of the slices of prosciutto he was serving. I found Wolfe in his chair in the office, a formidable bulk of a man, his eyes closed, his fingertips barely touching. He was either in deep thought or enjoying a particularly satisfying nap. I opted for the former, given the time of day. "Boss," I said, keeping my voice low, "we have a visitor. Eleanor Vance. She says it's about the poinsettia diamond and Julian Thorne." One of Wolfe's eyelids flickered, then opened a fraction. A single dark eye regarded me with mild irritation. "Gudu. Min. Must you always be the harbinger of impertinence?" She mentioned the poinsettia, and Julian Thorne. The big one. The one the police are tearing their hair out over. Wolfe grunted, a sound that could mean anything from mild interest to profound disgust. And what does Miss Vance have to do with this bauble? She didn't say exactly. Just that she needs to see you. She looks troubled. True. Blay, Wolfe muttered. As if the word itself were an unappetizing dish, he slowly opened both eyes, a process that always seemed to require considerable effort. He pushed himself upright, a leviathan stirring from the depths. Bring her in, Goodwin, and be swift. My orchids require my undivided attention in precisely 16 minutes. I stifled a grin. 16 minutes, always the precise measure of his condescension. I walked back to the office, a spring in my step. The poinsettia diamond. This promised to be far more interesting than tax deductions. I opened the office door. Miss Vance, I announced, Mr. Wolfe will see you now. Try not to upset his aesthetic sensibilities. Eleanor Vance didn't just walk into the office, she seemed to seep into it, her presence tentative and thin against the backdrop of Wolfe's massive mahogany desk and the wall-to-wall bookshelves. She sat in the red leather chair, the one I've seen some of the toughest grifters in New York sweat through, and looked at Wolfe as if he were a mountain she wasn't quite prepared to climb. Wolfe, for his part, didn't make it easy. He sat behind his desk, his 7th Avenue bulk immobile, his eyes leveled at her with the cold, unblinking clarity of a man who found the mere existence of a problem an affront to his dignity. I took my place at my desk, flipped my notebook open, and waited for the opening bell. Wolfe didn't speak. He never does when he can let the silence do the heavy lifting. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the elevator motor and the ticking of the clock, which seemed to be counting own the 16 minutes Wolfe had begrudgingly allotted. Mr. Wolfe, Eleanor began, her voice gaining a bit of steel now that she was in the presence of the legend. I am Julian Thorne's personal secretary. I have been for 8 years. I am also the only person, aside from Julian himself, who has the combination to the private vault at his upstate estate. Wolfe's eyelids did that slow, rhythmic droop that signifies he's actually listening, though he'd never admit it. A position of considerable trust, Wolfe remarked, his voice a deep, melodic rumble. And, I presume, considerable peril when that trust is seemingly violated. The police think I took it, she said. Inspector Cramer has spent the last 48 hours trying to find a gap in my alibi for Tuesday night. There isn't one, 'cause I was at the opera with 3 witnesses, but he seems to think I hired a professional. Julian hasn't said a word. He just looks at me. That's worse. The poinsettia diamond, Wolfe said, the words sounding like a bad taste in his mouth. A crimson stone of approximately 40 carats. Geologic fluke and social vanity. Tell me, Miss Vance, why should I concern myself with the recove? Rye of a bauble that should never have been plucked from the earth in the first place. Because it wasn't just stolen, Mr. Wolfe, it was replaced. I stopped my pen mid-stroke. That was a new wrinkle. The papers had been shouting about a theft, not a swap. Replaced? Wolfe repeated, his brow furrowing just enough to show he was piqued. With a glass replica, she said, reaching into her handbag, ND pulling out a small velvet-lined box. She set it on the desk. Julian found it yesterday morning. He didn't tell the police. He's terrified that if the public knows the real diamond is gone and a fake was left in its place, it will suggest an inside job. It would ruin the reputation of his security firm and, by extension, his entire financial empire. He wants the real stone back before the new. Year's Eve gala tonight. He's hosting it at the Brownstone, his own townhouse just 5 blocks from here. He intends to wear it on a lapel pin. If he doesn't have it, the rumors will start, and the shorts on his stock will begin by Monday morning. Wolfe didn't touch the box. He didn't even lean forward. A gala, tonight. You are asking for a miracle of speed, Miss Vance. I do not perform miracles. I perform deductions, and they require a diet of facts, not festive urgency. I'm not asking for a miracle, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I'm asking for protection. Someone is trying to frame me, and they've already moved into my apartment. Not to steal, but to plant. I found a set of jeweler's loupes and a receipt for a high-end glass cutter in my vanity drawer this morning. He didn't put them there. I looked at Wolfe. This was the disruption he usually hated, but there was a glint in his eye. Someone had bypassed a high-security vault and then dared to play a secondary game of evidence planting. It was messy. It was arrogant. It was exactly the kind of intellectual slap in the face that Wolfe couldn't ignore, even if he pretended to. You mentioned Julian Thorn's hoe. Sting this gala tonight, Wolfe said, shifting his weight. And you are expected to attend? I am expected to manage it, she corrected, along with the 3 other members of his inner circle who were at the estate when the vault was breached. His brother, his protégé, and his fiancée. A charming quartet, I chimed in. Are any of them particularly fond of glass cutting? She didn't smile. Any of them could have done it. They all know my habits. They all have reasons to want Julian diminished. But I can't prove it from the kitchen of a townhouse while I'm ordering more champagne. Wolfe sighed, a sound like a distant locomotive. Archie, check the weather. If the snow persists, I shall be inconvenienced. If it clears, I shall be merely annoyed. The snow is holding, I said. Why? Cause, Wolfe said, looking at Eleanor Vance with a gaze that finally held a spark of intent. If the poinsettia diamond is to be recovered before the stroke of midnight, we cannot wait for the suspects to come to us. You will return to Mr. Thorn's house. You will tell him that you have engaged me, and that Mr. Goodwin will be arriving shortly to act as your security consultant for the evening. He will observe, he will report, and he will ensure that no more jeweler's loupes find their way into your belongings. You're taking the case? She asked, a wave of relief washing over her face. I am accepting a retainer, Wolfe corrected. Archie, see to the paperwork. Miss Vance, I require a list of everyone who was at the estate on Tuesday, in detail. Do not leave out the help, though they are rarely imaginative enough for a theft of this caliber. This was a crime of ambition, not of need. As I led Eleanor back to the front door to get her details, I caught Wolfe staring at the small velvet box on his desk. He still hadn't opened it. He wasn't interested in the fake. He was already dissecting the mind of the person who had left it. The sanctity of the brownstone hadn't been breached yet. But the peace of his afternoon was gone. For Wolfe, that was a declaration of war. I'll need my tuxedo, won't I? I asked, returning to the office. And your wits, Archie. Though I suspect the tuxedo will be more heavily taxed tonight. He checked his watch. It was time for the orchids. The case had begun. By the time I reached the Thorn residence, the snow had turned into a fine crystal, line powder that swirled under the streetlights like ghostly lace. The townhouse was one of those limestone behemoths that looked less like a home and more like a fortress built for someone who didn't want to be told no. It was already humming with the kind of frantic energy that only billionaires and New Year's Eve can produce. I handed my coat to a footman who looked like he'd been hired for his ability to remain decorative while holding 20 pounds of mink, and I smoothed the front of my dinner jacket. I wasn't there to dance, but in this league, if you don't look like you belong, you might as well be wearing a sandwich board that says Private Eye. Eleanor Vance met me in the marble foyer. She looked even more frayed than she had in Wolfe's office, despite a fresh application of lipstick and a gown that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She gave me a curt nod and led me toward a small library off the main ballroom, away from the caterers who were currently engaged in a life-or-death struggle with a tower of shrimp cocktails. Julian is in a state, she whispered, her eyes darting toward the closed double doors. He's agreed to your presence, but only because I told him. Mr. Wolfe wouldn't take the case otherwise. He's told the others you're an insurance investigator performing a last-minute audit. Keep to that. I can play an actuary, I said. I'm very good at looking bored by math. Inside the library, the inner circle was already gathered, and the tension was thick enough to clog a drain. Julian Thorn was standing by the fireplace, a tall, whip-thin man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of a very expensive piece of flint. He was nursing a glass of clear liquid that I doubted was water. Goodwin, Thorne said, his voice clipped. "Eleanor says you're the best Wolfe has. I hope for your sake that's true. This isn't just a robbery, it's a provocation. Mr. Wolfe doesn't deal in bests, Mr. Thorne. He deals in res." "Alts," I told him, then turned my attention to the others. First was Arthur Thorne, Julian's brother. He was a softer, puffier version of Julian, looking like a man who had spent his life trying to catch up to a train that had already left the station. He was sweating despite the drafty room, his fingers fidgeting with a gold lighter. Next to him was Marcus Reed, Thorne's protege and the current G, olden boy of Thorne Ventures. He was in his late 20s, handsome in a way that felt manufactured, and he watched me with a gaze that was far too calculating for a mere employee. He had ambition written all over him in neon letters. Finally, tucked into a velvet armchair was Céleste Dubois, Julian's fiancée. She was a French actress who had traded the stage for the social register, and she was currently looking at the fireplace as if it had personally insulted her. She was wearing enough emeralds to sink a small boat, but the empty spot on her shoulder where the poinsettia diamond should have been was a gaping hole in her ensemble. "Is this really necessary?" Arthur Thorne piped up, his voice a bit too high. "A private investigator? Police have already raided everything. It's an embarrassment." "The police are looking for a thief in a mask, Arthur," Julian snapped. "Mr. Goodwin is here because the thief didn't need a mask. They had a key, or a combination." He looked pointedly at Eleanor, then at his brother. It was a lovely family dynamic. You could practically feel the daggers being sharpened. "I'll need to speak with each of you," I said, leaning against a mahogany desk. "Just a few questions about Tuesday night at the estate. I'm interested in logistics. Who was where, who saw what, and more importantly, who should be elsewhere. We've been through this," Marcus Reed said, stepping forward. He had that patronizing tone that usually makes me want to find a reason to accidentally trip someone. "We were all in the drawing room until 11. Eleanor went to the vault room to check the inventory for the gala. She came back 10 minutes later saying everything was fine. If the diamond was swapped, that was the window. Or, Eleanor countered, her voice trembling but firm, someone had already swapped it before I got there, and I simply didn't notice the difference between 40 carats of red diamond and 40 carats of red glass in a darkened room. A professional wouldn't make that mistake, Eleanor, Celeste said, finally speaking. Her English was perfect, accented with just enough Parisian chic to be annoying. "But then, we are all amateurs here, aren't we? Except for Mr. Goodwin." I smiled at her. It wasn't my best smile, but it served. "I'm just a man with a notebook, Mr. Boyce. Tell me, did any of you notice anything odd Tuesday night? A door left AJ. Ah? A strange car? A brother who seemed a little too nervous?" Arthur Thorne turned a mottled shade of purple. "Now see here." "Quiet, Arthur," Julian commanded. He looked at me, his eyes cold. "You have until midnight, Goodwin. At midnight the guests arrive, the press arrives, and I go out onto that balcony. I will either have the poinsettia on my lapel, or I will be the laughingstock of the Finn. Anchel world. If you find it, Wolfe gets his fee. If you don't, I suggest you find your own way home through the snow." I checked my watch. 7 o'clock. 5 hours to find a rock the size of a pigeon's egg in a house full of people who hated each other. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was probably finishing his dinner, sipping a glass of beer and contemplating the gross inefficiency of the human R. Ace. I envied him. "I'll start with the vault room," I said. "And Eleanor, I'd like to see those gifts someone left in your vanity. I have a feeling the person who planted them is currently in this room, and they're probably wondering why I'm not wearing handcuffs yet." I caught Marcus Reed's expression for a split second before he masked it. It wasn't fear, it was a smirk. He thought he was smart. RTR than the room. That's the problem with people who think they're the smartest person in the room. They usually forget that Nero Wolfe isn't in the room with them. He's everywhere else. I spent the next 2 hours earning my keep, which in this house meant dodging caterers and poking my nose into places where the wallpaper cost more than my apartment. The Thorne townhouse was a labyrinth of force, elegance, and the atmosphere was getting more brittle by the minute. I started with the vault room, a windowless box of reinforced steel and vanity, where the ghost of the poinsettia diamond still seemed to mock everyone involved. There were no scratches on the lock, no scorched earth from a thermal lance, and no signs of a struggle. It was a clean, surgical extraction, the kind that requires a CA, LM pulse, and a very specific set of numbers. I moved to Eleanor's quarters. The gifts she'd mentioned were exactly where she'd found them, a pair of professional-grade jeweler's loupes and a receipt from a hardware shop in Queens for a high-end glass cutter, tucked neatly beneath a pile of silk scarves. It was too neat. A real thief doesn't leave a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to their own vanity unless they're auditioning for a role in a very bad melodrama. Someone was trying to wrap this up in a bow for the police, and they weren't being particularly subtle about it. I decided to start shaking the trees to see what kind of fruit fell out. I caught Arthur Thorne in the billiards room, where he was nursing a scotch and looking at a cue ball as if it had the answers to his Mountie. "Engie debts? Rough night for a game, Arthur?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He jumped, nearly slopping his drink. "Goodwin, don't you people wear shoes that make noise? And it's Mr. Thorne to you." "My apologies. Mr. Thorne, let's talk about your brokerage accounts. I hear the market hasn't been kind to Thorne-adjacent stocks lately, especially the ones you've been leveraging to keep your lifestyle in the black." Arthur's face went from pale to a dusty grey. "That's none of your business. Julian handles the family interests." "Julian handles his interests," I corrected. "I imagine a 40-carat diamond would go a long way toward settling a margin call, or just provide enough collateral to keep wolves out the door." "Where were you at 10:15 Tuesday night? Eleanor says you step D out of the drawing room to take a call." "I was on the terrace. I needed air. Julian's moods are suffocating. Cold night for air," I noted. "The terrace happens to have a service entrance that leads directly to the vault corridor. Must be a coincidence." I left him sputtering and found Marcus Reed in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic ferns that looked as hungry as he did. He was on his cell phone, speaking in the low, rapid-fire tone of a man closing a deal he shouldn't be making. He hung up the moment he saw me. "Checking the midnight stock prices, Marcus? I'm ensuring the guest list is handled. Goodwin. Julian expects perfection. He also expects loyalty. I did a little checking while I was auditing the files. You've been remarkably chummy with the competition lately. Unveiled firm is looking to pick up Thorne Ventures if the stock dips low enough. A scandal involving a stolen diamond and an inside job would be just the nudge they need, wouldn't it? And I'm sure there's a vice presidency in it for the man who opened the door." Reed didn't blink. He had the kind of composure that's either the result of total innocence or total sociopathy. "Julian is a relic. He's thin. KSA Diamond makes him powerful. Power is information, Mr. Goodwin. If I wanted to ruin Julian, I wouldn't need a rock to do it. Maybe not. But the rock makes a great distraction while you're moving the pieces on the board. By 10 o'clock, I had a notebook full of motives and a headache. Celeste Dubois was the hardest to pin down. She spent the evening drifting like a beautiful cloud of perfume, claiming she knew nothing of vaults or diamonds. Only that Julian had promised her the poinsettia for the gala, and she felt vulnerability in its absence. She also happened to have a cousin in Antwerp who specialized in the recutting of famous stones, a detail she'd neglected to mention to the police. I slipped into the pantry and dialed the brownstone. Fritz answered on the first ring. "Wick." H meant Wolfe was likely in the office, nursing a beer and waiting for the world to catch up to him. "Fritz, put him on." A moment later, the familiar weary rumble came through the line. "Yes, Archie. I trust you haven't been seduced by the caviar. The caviar is mediocre, but the suspects are top shelf. We've got a brother with gambling debts, a protege playing both sides of a corporate takov, and a fiancé with a suspicious family tree in the Diamond District. And Eleanor's being framed with all the grace of a falling piano." "And the stone?" Wolfe asked, "still missing. But I found something, or rather, I didn't find something. The glass replica Eleanor brought to you, it was high quality. But I checked the vault room. There's a faint residue of floral wax on the velvet lining of the display case. It doesn't match the replica." "Wax," Wolfe repeated. and I could almost hear his brain shifting gears. "Archie, you said Julian Thorne intends to wear the diamond on a lapel pin at midnight. That's the plan. He's going to announce the triumph of its recovery. Even if he has to wear the fake to save face, he must not," Wolfe said, his voice sharpening with a rare edge of command. "If he pins that glass to his chest, the game is lost. I need you to perform a very specific errand. Tell Mr. Thorne that I require the presence of his entire household at the brownstone. Now. Boss, he's got 500 people arriving in 2 hours. Then he has 2 hours to resolve his future. Tell him I know not only who has the diamond, but why they haven't dared to move it yet. Bryn. Gee them, Archie. All of them. And bring the wax." I hung up, looking at the ballroom where the first of the early arrivals were being announced. This was going to be a very loud exit. Getting Julian Thorne to abandon his own New Year's Eve gala was like trying to convince a king to abdicate during his coronation. He looked at me with a mixture of fury and disbelief that would have withered a lesser. Man, but I've spent years being stared down by Nero Wolfe, so Thorne's aristocratic glare felt like a warm breeze. I stood my ground in the middle of his private study while the muffled sounds of an orchestra tuning up echoed through the floorboards. "Mr. Wolfe does not summon people for the exercise," I told him, keeping my voice level. "He has found the thread. If you stay here and pin that glass, imitation to your lapel, you aren't just lying to your guests, you're walking into a trap that will finish you. Whoever took Poinsettia didn't just want the stone, they wanted the spectacle of your failure." Thorne's jaw tightened. He looked at the velvet box on his desk, then at the 4 people I had rounded up: Eleanor, looking like she was headed for the guillotine; Arthur, who was sweating tea; Prove, his bespoke shirt; Marcus Reed, checking his watch with practiced boredom; and Celeste, whose expression was a mask of icy indifference. "If this is a waste of time, Goodwin," Thorne hissed, "I'll have Wolfe's license and your head." "The cars are waiting," I said. The drive back to the brownstone was the quietest trip I've ever taken in a convoy of limousines. The snow was coming down in E. Harnessed now, thick and silent, turning 35th Street into a white canyon. When we arrived, I ushered the quintet through the front door. Fritz was there to take coats, his face a picture of professional calm although we were tracking slush onto the rugs. The office was exactly as I'd left it, except for the air of heavy expectation. Wolfe was behind his desk, a glass of beer at his elbow and his eyes half closed. He didn't rise, he never does, but the way he shifted his bulk signaled that the stage was set. "Please be seated," Wolfe said, his voice a dry rumble that filled the room. "I apologize for the disruption of your festivities, but as the alternative was your collective ruin, I assumed you would find the detour acceptable." "Ruin?" Marcus Reed smirked, leaning against a bookshelf. "It's a bit dramatic, even for a private detective, isn't it?" Wolfe didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on a small glass slide on his desk, under a magnifying lens. "Drama is for those who lack the patience for logic, Mr. Reed. I have spent the last hour contemplating a very specific substance Archie recovered from the vault, floral wax. I hadn't even realized I'd handed it over, but Wolfe's fingers had been busy while I was playing herder. Floral wax is a common enough thing," Wolfe continued, "used by florists to preserve the luster of petals, or by jewelers to hold a stone in place during a delicate setting. But this wax has a specific scent, a faint, lingering note of Cattleya trianae, an orchid." The room went still. Eleanor Vance frowned. "But there are no flowers in the vault." "Julian doesn't allow them. The humidity—" "Precisely," Wolfe cut her. "No flowers in the vault. And yet the residue was there, on the velvet where the diamond sat. It suggests that the person who handled the stone didn't just have a key, they had a very specific, recent proximity to a greenhouse, or perhaps they used the wax to create a quick impression." Watched the suspects. Arthur was looking at his shoes. Reed was looking at the ceiling. Celeste was looking at Wolfe. "But that's not what caught my attention," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave. "What caught my attention was the trespass. Archie, Tell them what you found in the spice cupboard before you left this evening." I blinked. I hadn't found anything in a spice cupboard. I hadn't even been in the kitchen. I looked at Woe, LFE, and for a split second, I saw the tiniest flicker of an eyelid. A signal. He was improvising, or rather, he was baiting a hook. "Right," I said, catching the rhythm. "The saffron, or what was left of it. Someone had been through the pantry at the Thorne house, looking for something to neutralize the scent of that wax. They were messy. It was a total lie, but it worked." Arthur Thorne's hand went to his pocket. A quick, jerky motion that he tried to turn into a scratch. "This is absurd," Julian Thorne barked. "My brother doesn't know a spice cupboard from a coal cellar. If you brought us here to talk about wax and saffron, I brought you here," Wolfe snapped, the sudden volume of his voice making everyone jump, "because the poinsettia diamond is currently inside this room. It was Neve." R moved to a fence. It was never hidden in a vanity. It was kept close, because the thief is a coward who couldn't bear to let the prize out of his sight, even as he tried to pin the crime on a defenseless woman. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "The wax wasn't just for an impression, was it, Mr. Thorne? It was to secure the stone to something you're wearing right now, the of." Vice tension reached a breaking point. Outside, the wind howled against the window panes, but inside, the only sound was the heavy, labored breathing of a man who realized the walls were closing in. Wolfe wasn't looking at Arthur anymore. He was looking at Marcus Reed, whose smug expression had finally, gloriously begun to melt. "Archie," Wolfe said quietly, "if Mr. Reed would be so kind as to over his cufflink, the left one, the one that seems to be sitting just a bit higher than the right." Reed didn't move. He looked at the door, but I was already standing in front of it. The cat and mouse game had moved from the ballroom to the brownstone, and the mouse was cornered. "You're bluffing," Reed whispered. "I never bluff about orchids, Mr. Reed," Wolfe said, "or about theft." Marcus Reed didn't move, but the air around him seemed to lose its charge, collapsing into the hollow stillness of a man who had run out of track. His hand hovered near his left sleeve, then dropped. The smugness that had been his armor for the last 3 hours wasn't just melting, it was evaporating, leaving behind a raw, jagged desperation. Julian Thorne stepped toward his protégé, his face a mask of Predat, hoary fury that made the financier look 10 years younger and infinitely more dangerous. "The cufflink, Marcus," Thorne said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Now," Reed took a breath, his eyes darting toward the window, as if he could leap through the glass and vanish into the New York snow. Seeing me blocking the only exit, he slowly reached for his left wrist. With trembling fingers, he unlatched the heavy gold link. It wasn't the diamond itself, of course. No man, even one as arrogant as Reed, would walk around with a 40-carat crimson stone dangling from his shirt, but the link was a hollow, custom-made housing. He set it on Wolfe's desk with the clatter of a spent casing. Wolfe didn't touch it. He didn't have to. "Archie, if you would be so kind. My pocket magnifier is in the top drawer." I stepped over, picked up the link, and examined the underside. There it was, a thin, translucent smear of that floral wax Wolfe had been harping on. It served as a primitive but effective adhesive, ensuring that whatever was tucked inside wouldn't rattle or slip. But the link was empty. "He's got the wax, but where's the stone?" I asked, looking at Reed. "A cufflink can hold a secret, but it can't hold the poinsettia. Not unless you've had it ground into powder." "I don't have it," Reed snarled, his voice cracking. "I don't have the diamond. I never did. This is a setup. Someone put that wax on my link while I was in the cloakroom." "A desperate plea," Wolfe remarked, leaning back and crossing his palms over his middle, "and one that might hold water if you hadn't spent the evening checking your pulse every 10 minutes. You weren't worried about the police, Mr. Reed. You were worried about the weight. A diamond of that size has a specific gravity that a man of your tactile sensitivity would notice if it were missing from its hiding place. If it's not in the link, Wolfe, where is it?" Julian Thorne demanded, his patience finally snapping. "The clock is ticking. It's nearly 11. "It is not in the link because Mr. Reed is merely the architect of the distraction," Wolfe said, his eyes shifting toward the corner of the room where Saul Panzer had quietly slipped in 5 minutes ago. I hadn't even heard the door, but that's Saul for you. He can move through a room full of dry leaves without making a sound. Saul was holding a small, damp cardboard box. Good evening, Saul Wolfe, he said. I trust your trip to the Thorn Conservatory was productive. Very, Mr. Wolfe, Saul said, his scratchy voice sounding like a comfort after all the high society whining. The Cattleya orchids were exactly where Miss Vance's floor plan said they'd be, and someone had recently disturbed the potting soil in the third bench from the door. I found this buried 6 inches down. Saul opened tea. He box. Resting on a bed of damp peat moss was a crimson spark that seemed to catch every light in the office and throw it back with interest. It was the poinsettia diamond, raw and bleeding red in the lamplight. Eleanor Vance let out a sob that was half relief and half horror. Arthur Thorne sat in his chair, looking like he might faint. The wax, you see, Wolfe explained, his voice taking on the instructional tone he uses when he's particularly pleased with himself, wasn't for the cufflink. It was to seal the stone inside a waterproof casing before it was buried in the alkaline soil of the orchid house. The cufflink was merely the transport. Mr. Reed, being the protégé, had unfettered access to the estate. He took the stone Tuesday, replaced it with the glass, and carried the real gem OU. Tea in his sleeve, but he couldn't risk taking it past the security gates or keeping it in his apartment. He hid it in the one place he knew Julian would never look, the conservatory. Julian views plants as mere furniture. He would never notice a slight disturbance in the dirt. But why frame Eleanor? I asked. The loops, the receipt. That was a lot of extra work. It was the insurance, Wolfe. If the theft were discovered too soon, a scapegoat was required to end the investigation before the discovery of the diamond in a pawn shop months later. Or perhaps Mr. Reed intended to find the stone himself after Julian's stock plummeted, casting himself as the savior of the company while Eleanor took the fall. Reed looked at the diamond, then at Wolfe, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. You fat, arrogant, quiet, Wolfe snapped. Your vocabulary is as limited as your ethics. Archie, called Inspector Cramer. Tell him we have a New Year's gift for him, though he will undoubtedly complain about the wrapping. Wait, Julian Thorne said, stepping forward. He reached for the diamond, but Saul expertly shifted the box out of reach. Thorne looked at Wall. Faye, the police don't need to be involved in the details. Reed is finished. I'll ruin him privately. But I need that stone for the gala. Give it to me. Wolfe's eyes went cold, the kind of cold that makes the New York winter look like a tropical vacation. Mr. Thorne, you hired me to find the truth. I have found it. Disposition of evidence is a matter for the law, not your vanity. If you wish to that stone tonight, you will do so with a police escort, and you will testify against the man who tried to gut your empire from the inside. You're overstepping, Wolfe, Thorne hissed. I'm standing exactly where I always stand, Wolfe replied, picking up his beer. On the facts side. Archie, the phone. I reached for the receiver, catching Reed's eye as I did. He looked like he wanted to bow. But Saul was already hovering near his elbow. The game was over, even if the party was just getting started 5 blocks away. The office felt smaller as the weight of the poinsettia diamond sat on the desk, its crimson facets drawing the light like a magnet. I had the phone in my hand, but I didn't dial just yet. I knew that look on Wolfe's face. He wasn't finished. When Wolfe reaches the end of a case, he usually has a few more knots to tie, most of them involving the specific brand of justice he prefers, the kind that leaves everyone slightly uncomfortable but legally satisfied. Julian Thorne was vibrating with a suppressed energy that probably made his board of directors tremble. He looked at the diamond, then at Reed, then back at Wolfe. You don't understand the implications, Thor, Ney said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If Marcus is arrested now, tonight, the news will hit the morning editions. The takeover connection will be analyzed by every Wall Street shark. I need time to insulate the firm. Give me 48 hours. Wolfe took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer. He wiped his lips with a linen handkerchief and looked at Thorne as if he were a particularly dull species of beetle. 48 hours, Mr. Thorne, is an eternity in the world of deception. It is more than enough time for evidence to vanish, for witnesses to be coerced, and for a man like Mr. Reed to find a country without an extradition treaty. You are asking me to be an accessory to a delay that benefits only your portfolio. I am asking for professional courtesy, Thorne snapped. My courtesy is reserved for those who do not attempt to bargain with the truth, Wolfe replied. Archie, dial. I began to rotate the dial the old-fashioned way, which always adds a nice bit of rhythmic tension to a room. Cramer. I was halfway through the issue when Marcus Reed did something unexpected. He didn't run for the door, and he didn't lunge for the diamond. He started to laugh. It was a dry, hacking sound that lacked any trace of humor. Go ahead, Julian, Reed said, straightening his jacket even as Saul Panzer kept a firm grip on his arm. Call the police. Let them investigate. Let them look into the special accounts I was managing for you, the ones you used to facilitate, the poinsettia's purchase without notifying the tax authorities. If I go down for the theft, you go down for the fraud. We can share a cell in Sing Sing. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like the floorboards might give way. Julian Thorne's face went from a vibrant, angry red to a sickly, translucent white. He looked at his protégé, the man he had handpicked and groomed, and realized he had invited a viper into his nest that knew exactly where the softest parts of his belly were. Wolfe's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. To anyone else, it was nothing. To me, it was a standing ovation. This was the positioning he loved. The suspects were now tearing apart without him having to move a muscle. A stalemate, Wolfe observed, his voice almost purring. How tedious. Mr. Reed, you are attempting to use your own complicity in Mr. Thorne's financial irregularities as a shielder guy. NST a charge of grand larceny. And Mr. Thorne, you are considering letting a thief walk free to protect a reputation that is already, by your own admission, built on a foundation of sand. I'll give you double the fee, Wolfe, Thorne said, not looking at anyone. Triple. Just get them out of here. Let me handle it. You haven't the resources to handle me, Mr. Thorne, Wolfe said, his voice turny. End like a blade. And you certainly haven't the character. You came to this house because your sanctuary had been disturbed. You asked for my help because you were afraid. Now that the fear has shifted from the loss of a stone to the loss of your prestige, you find the truth inconvenient. Wolfe turned his gaze to Eleanor Vance, who had been standing silently by the window. Miss Vance, you were he one who brought this matter to me. You were the one being framed for a crime that would have ended your life as you know it. What is your preference? Should I take the money and let these two gentlemen settle their grievances in private? Or should I proceed with the call to the police? Eleanor looked at Julian Thorne, the man she had served for 8 years. She looked at the diamond that had caused so much misery in a single week. Then she looked at Marcus Reed. I found the glass cutter in my drawer, Julian, she said softly. You would have let them take me. You didn't say a word in my defense when the police were questioning me. You were just waiting to see which way the wind blew. Eleanor, be reasonable, Thorne began. I'm done being reasonable, she said. Her voice was steady. Ow, the tremor gone. Mr. Wolfe, call the inspector. If Julian has to answer for his accounts, that's his business. But I won't spend the rest of my life wondering if Marcus is going to finish what he started. I didn't wait for Wolfe to nod. I finished the dial. The connection went through, and the familiar gravelly bark of Inspector Cramer filled the receiver. He sounded like he'd been having a lousy New Year's Eve, which was about to get a whole lot more complicated. Cramer, this is Archie Goodwin. Happy New Year. If you can beat the snow, we've got a red-hot rock and a couple of cold-hearted financiers waiting for you at the brownstone. Bring a big car. We're doing a bulk delivery. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. He had leaned back again, his eyes closed. The tension in the room hadn't vanished, but the direction of it had changed. The battle was no longer about diamonds. It was about survival. Saul, Wolfe said without opening his eyes, ensure Mr. Reed and Mr. Thorne remain in their chairs. Archie, I believe there is still some of that beer left in the kitchen. The atmosphere here has become stagnant. I headed for the door, passing Julian Thorne, who looked like a man-what. Ching his empire dissolve in a glass of champagne. As I walked down the hall, I could hear the faint, distant sirens beginning to wail over the sound of the wind. The poinsettia diamond was safe, but the people who owned it were about to find out that some things can't be polished. The office was a study in static electricity. Saul Panzer sat on a small stool by the door, looking about as threatened. Is a retired bookkeeper. Yet the way he held his gaze on Marcus Reed ensured the younger man didn't so much as twitch. Julian Thorne had collapsed into the red leather chair, his regal posture finally shattered, while Eleanor Vance stood near the globe, her back to the room, looking out at the snow. Arthur Thorne and Celeste Du Bois had retreated to the far corners of the office like shadows that had lost their substance. When the heavy thud of the front door echoed through the hallway, followed by the unmistakable cadence of footsteps that knew they had the law behind them, the room seemed to exhale. Inspector Cramer marched in, his overcoat dusted with white, his hat gripped in a hand that looked ready to punch a hole through a wall. Behind him was Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins, looking as sour as a man whose New Year's Eve had been interrupted by a summons to 35th Street usually does. Cramer didn't see the diamond first. He didn't even look at the suspects. He looked at Nero Wolfe. Every time, Wolfe, Cramer barked, his face a shade of pink that rivaled the stone on the desk. Every time there's a headline-grabbing mess in this city, I find myself standing on your rug while you sigh. Tea there, looking like you invented the 10 Commandments. What have you got? Wolfe opened his eyes, a slow and deliberate movement. I have a thief, an accomplice by negligence, and the object of their shared obsession. Archie, if you would be so kind as to provide the inspector with the chronology. My throat is dry. I gave it to him straight. I laid out the theft of the poinsettia, the substitutee, on of the glass replica, the framing of Eleanor Vance, and the discovery of the stone in the orchid house. I didn't leave out Marcus Reed's hollow cufflink or the smell of the floral wax. As I spoke, Cramer's eyes shifted to Reed, then to the diamond, then finally to Julian Thorne. And what's this about special accounts? Cramer asked, leaning over the desk. He had picked up on the tail end of the argument before I'd made the call. I heard a whisper that Mr. Thorne here was more worried about a ledger than a larceny. A secondary matter, Inspector, Wolfe interjected, his voice smooth as silk, one that I'm sure your colleagues in the district attorney's office will find fascinating. However, the immediate concern is diamond theft. Mr. Reed here has confessed, not through a sense of remorse, but through a clumsy attempt at blackmail when cornered. He removed the stone from the vault on Tuesday evening, using his position of trust to facilitate the swap. I didn't confess to anything, Reed shouted, though his voice lacked conviction. You sat in that chair and threatened your employer with exposure of his financial malfeasance in exchange for silence, Wolfe said coldly. In his room with 4 witnesses and a man of Mr. Panzer's unimpeachable memory. That is a confession of motive and opportunity, if not a formal statement of guilt. The stone was found where you hid it. The wax on your cufflink matches the residue in the vault. Your career as a financier is over. Your career as a defendant is just beginning. Cramer turned to Stebbins. Pearlie, take Mr. Reed down to the car and keep him separate from the others. I want a statement before he remembers he has a lawyer. Stebbins moved with shark efficiency. He had Reed out of the room in 30 seconds, the young man's protests dying out as the door closed. Cramer then turned his attention to Julian Thorne, who was staring at the poinsettia diamond as if it were a poisonous spider. As for you, Mr. Thorne, CR, Amer said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. I don't care how many mayors you've had lunch with. If there's fraud in those books, I'll find it. You can come down with us now, or I can send a squad car to pick you up at your gala. Which do you think will look better on the front page? Thorne rose slowly, his dignity a tattered rag. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor, I don't, she sighed. Not turning. Just go, Julian. The room cleared out slowly. Cramer took the diamond, sealing it in a heavy evidence bag with a look of grim satisfaction. He gave Wolfe a nod, a gesture that for Cramer was the equivalent of a 21-gun salute, and followed his men out into the snow. The silence that returned to the brownstone was heavy, but it was no longer a silence of suspicion. It was tea. silence of a house that had been purged. Eleanor Vance was the last to leave. She stopped by the desk, looking at Wolfe with an expression that was hard to read. "You saved me, Mr. Wolfe, not just from prison, but from staying with him. I think I knew what he was, but I didn't want to see it. Knowledge is often a burden, Miss Vance," Wolfe said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "But it is the only foundation worth building upon. Archie will see you in a cab." When I returned from the front door, the office was empty of outsiders. Saul had slipped away to catch his train back to Brooklyn, and the only sound was the wind rattling the window panes. Wolfe was sitting in his chair, his hands resting on the arms, staring at the spot where the diamond had been. "Well," I said, leaning, "G against my desk. That's one way to ring in the new year. I assume we're sending a bill to Thorne, even if he is headed for a grand jury?" "Naturally," Wolfe said. "His moral failings do not exempt him from his financial obligations. In fact, I shall increase the fee by 20% to account for the insult to my intelligence he attempted at the end." He pushed himself up from the chair, a monumental effort, and looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. "Archie, tell Fritz we shall have the midnight snack in the dining room. I find I have a sudden, inexplicable craving for something that hasn't been buried in a flower pot." "Coming right up," I said. "Happy New Year, boss." Wolfe paused at the door, his silhouette massive against the hallway light. "It is a new year, Archie. Let us hope it contains fewer diamonds and more sense." The transition from the chaos of a high-stakes investigation to the structured stillness of the brownstone always felt like coming up for air after a long dive in murky water. By the time I had locked the front door and double-bolted it against the New York winter, the sirens had faded into the muffled hum of the city. The office was empty, but the ghost of the evening's tension lingered in the air, smelling of damp wool, expensive perfume, and the faint metallic tang of the poinsettia diamond. Wolfe had already retreated, his massive frame having navigated the hallway with the SERP. Rising grace, he occasionally summoned when the prize was a comfortable chair and a quiet room. I found him in the dining room, where the light from the chandelier reflected off the polished wood of the table with a warmth that made the events of the last few hours feel like a fever dream. Fritz had outdone himself, presumably as a silent protest against the disruption of his kitchen. There was a platter of pâté de foie gras, a bowl of chilled endive, and a bottle of beer that was exactly the temperature Wolfe considered civilized. Wolfe didn't look up as I entered. He was busy spreading a thin layer of pâté onto a piece of toast with the precision of a diamond cutter. Ironic, considering the night we'd had. He took a bite, chewed with a slow, meditative focus, and then let out a sigh that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't a sigh of exhaustion, but of recalibration. "The problem with people like Julian Thorne," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the quiet, "is that they mistake possession for permanence. He believed that owning the poinsettia made him invulnerable to the very rot he was cultivating in his own house. Diamond is stone, Archie. It has no loyalty, no. Some memory, and certainly no power to protect a man from his own vanity." I pulled out my chair and sat down, helping myself to a piece of toast. He's going to have plenty of time to think about that while the DA is going through his special accounts. Reed was a snake, sure, but Thorne provided the garden. He's as much a part of that theft as the man who held the glass cutter. Wolfe grunted in anger. "Ement. He sought to use me as a tool to maintain a facade. That is an unpardonable insolence. He did not want justice, he wanted a restoration of his illusions. When the two diverged, he was prepared to sacrifice Miss Vance, the law, and common decency to preserve the image of his own greatness." "And Reed?" I asked. "He thought he was the new king of the hill. He had the stone, the plan, and leverage. Where did he trip up, besides the part where he underestimated you?" "He tripped on his own arrogance," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer. "He believed that because he was more clever than Julian Thorne, he was more clever than the world at large. He assumed that a private investigator would be bedazzled by the glitter of the Thorne name or the complexity of the corporate stakes. He failed to account for the fact that a crime, no matter how high the price tag, is ultimately a matter of physics and psychology. He moved a physical object, and he left psychological tracks. The wax was a physical necessity. The framing of Miss Vance was a psychological one. Both were his undoing. Wolfe paused, looking at the empty space on the table as if he could see the entire case laid out in a series of logical equations. He chose the orchid house because he believed it was a place of no consequence, a mere hobbyist's retreat. He did not realize that to a mind that respects the complexity of nature, a disturbed patch of soil is as loud as a shout. He treated the conservatory as a dumping ground, and in doing so, he insulted the very order of the world. Well, Saul didn't mind the dirt, I said, thinking of our operative's uncanny ability to find exactly what was hidden. He's probably home by now, scrubbed clean and sleeping the sleep of the just. I wish I could say the same for the rest of them. Eleanor looked like she'd been through a meat grinder. Miss Vance has gained something far more valuable than a diamond, Wolfe remarked, his eyes sharpening. She has gained the truth about her surroundings. It is a harsh gift, and often an unwelcome one, but it is the only thing that allows for a genuine life. She is no longer an ornament in Mr. Thorne's collection. She is a woman with her eyes open. I looked at the clock. It was 20 minutes past midnight. Somewhere uptown, the party was likely turning into a wake as the news of the police raid trickled through the Cham. Panny-soaked crowd. The year was starting with a bang for the tabloids, but in the brownstone, the only sound was the clink of a fork against china. I'll start the paperwork in the morning, I said, leaning back. The billing, the statements for Cramer, the whole bit. I suppose we should send a separate invoice to the insurance company for the recovery of the stone. See what you do, Wolfe said, his tone returning to its usual brusque efficiency. And ensure the messenger sends the Thorne bill. I want it on his desk before the lawyers arrive to sequester his assets. I have no desire to be an unsecured creditor in his bankruptcy. He finished his beer and rose, the movement signaling the end of the session. He stood there for a moment, a colossus of intellect and appetite, looking around. His dining room as if confirming that everything was once again in its proper place. The intrusion was over. The sanctity of the house had been defended. Go to bed, Archie, he commanded. The year is already old, and I have a new shipment of dendrobium arriving on Tuesday. I require you to be alert for the unpacking. I will not have them bruised by a man who is half asleep. Right, I said, watching him head for the elevator. No bruises, just logic. I stayed in the dining room for a few minutes after he left, finishing the last of the pâté. Through the window, I could see the snow still falling, a white veil draped over the city. It was a new year, and as usual, Nero Wolfe had cleared the air by making sure the right people were in the wrong place. The morning after a case always feels like the world has been scrubbed behind the ears. The snow had stopped, leaving New York City looking surprisingly innocent in the pale, cold light of New Year's Day. Inside the brownstone, the atmosphere had returned to its default setting, a mixture of Fritz's kitchen aromas and the faint, earthy scent of the plant rooms upstairs. I was in the office, my fingers flying over the keys of the underwood, trying to turn the mess of the previous night into a coherent report that wouldn't make the district attorney's head explode. At 11 o'clock sharp, the sound of the elevator announced Wolfe's descent. He stepped into the office, his yellow silk pajamas replaced by a fresh suit of custom-tailored boulders. He didn't say good morning, he rarely does. He walked to his desk, checked the thermometer, adjusted the blotter by a fraction of an inch, and finally lowered himself into his chair with a grunt of satisfaction. He looked like a man who had successfully repelled an invasion, which in his mind he had. The Thorne file is nearly finished, I said, not looking up from my typing. I've included a copy of the receipt for the floral wax and Saul's statement regarding the excavation in the conservatory. I also took the liberty of calling the hospital. Eleanor Vance was released this morning. She's staying with a friend in Connecticut until the dust settles. Wolfe made a sound that might have been a humph of approval. He picked up the morning paper, his eyes scanning the headlines. The poinsettia diamond was there, of course, splashed across the front page with a grainy photo of Marcus Reed being led away in handcuffs and a smaller, less flattering one of Julian Thorne looking like he'd just swallowed a lemon. They're calling it the Crimson Betrayal, I noted, very poetic. The papers are already speculating on how much of the Thorn Empire is going to be liquidated to cover the legal fees and the inevitable SEC investigation. Humanity's fascination with shiny stones is a peculiar form of madness, Archie W. Wolfe said, his voice a steady, rhythmic bass. They take a piece of carbon, imbue it with a value that has no basis in utility, and then proceed to kill, lie, and steal to possess it. Mr. Thorn's empire was not built on the diamond, but the diamond became the symbol of his rot. It was a beacon for men like Mr. Reed, who recognized that where there is great vanity, there is usually great vulnerability. Litty? I don't know, I said, leaning back and stretching my arms. It was a pretty nice rock. Even you have to admit it had a certain presence. It had the presence of a disruption, Wolfe countered. It brought cold air into this house, it interrupted my schedule, and it forced me to interact with individuals whose moral compasses are spinning like tops. I find the presence of a well-grown CA Tatlia far more impressive. It doesn't require a vault, and it doesn't tempt men to perjury. It does require a lot of expensive peat moss and a full-time chef to keep the owner happy, I pointed out. Wolfe ignored that. He was looking at the mail, specifically a small hand-delivered envelope that had arrived an hour earlier. He opened it with a silver letter opener and read the contents. After a moment, he tossed it onto the blotter. A note from Miss Vance, he said. She wishes to express her gratitude. She also informs me that she has resigned her position, effective immediately. She intends to move to New Mexico and open a pottery studio. Pottery, I repeated. Well, it's a lot harder to frame someone for stealing a clay pot than a 40-carat diamond. I think she's got tea. Right idea. A little sun, a little mud, and no billionaires in sight. It sounds like a vacation. It sounds like a retreat into simplicity, Wolfe said, which is the only logical response to an encounter with Mr. Thorn's brand of complexity. She has realized that the cost of being indispensable to a man like that is far too high. Fritz appeared at the door carrying a tray with 2 bottles of beer and a glass. He put them on Wolfe's desk and gave me a quick wink. Fritz knew the storm had passed. The brownstone was once again a fortress of routine, and for a man like Wolfe, routine is the only true form of justice. Wolfe poured his beer, watching the head settle with a critical eye. We are finished with the poinsettia, Archie. The stone is in a police locker, the thief is in a cell. And the victim is in a state of terminal self-reflection. Let us turn our attention to things of actual substance. Did the delivery from the orchid supplier arrive? 10 minutes ago. I put the crates in the potting room. They look healthy. Then the day is not entirely lost, Wolfe said. He took a long, appreciative swallow of his beer and looked out the window at the clear, blue sky. A new year, Archie. A fresh start for those with the sense to take it, and a continuation of the same follies for the rest. I find myself remarkably content to stay inside. I turned back to my typewriter, the clack of the keys filling the room. The case was closed, charges were pending, and the world outside was as messy as ever. But here, under the watchful eye of a man who preferred logic to diamonds and beer to champagne, things were exactly as they should be. I'll have this wrapped up by lunch, I said. Good, Wolfe replied, his eyes already drifting shut for his mid-morning meditation. I believe Fritz is preparing a gigot d'agneau. It would be a pity to approach such a dish with the distraction of unfinished cuisine. Smiled to myself. New Year's Eve had been a circus, but New Year's Day was pure Wolfe. The diamond was gone, but the appetite remained. And in the end, that was the only result that really mattered on 35th Street.